Her bravery was inspirational, extraordinary. She received the George Cross. She would never accept any recognition for her special contribution without reminding us that she was the face of a much wider body of operations.
The words were barely spoken before the room seemed to stop breathing. Princess Anne, standing beneath the symbols of generations of royal authority, delivered a final decree that no one inside the palace had expected her to make. Catherine was not merely being praised, promoted, or protected. She was being named the crown's true successor, the woman Anne believed possessed the discipline, sacrifice, and moral strength required to preserve the monarchy when everything around it began to fracture. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne lowered her eyes to the page and read the decision again. The private council chamber, a closed room used for sensitive royal decisions, had witnessed arguments before. She named Catherine the crown's true successor in duty, character, and guardianship, granting her authority over future traditions and family continuity. The decree did not change the legal line of succession, the formal order deciding who becomes monarch. It declared who Anne trusted to carry the monarchy's moral weight. Catherine did not smile. She gripped the back of a chair and stared at Anne. Fear came before pride. She understood what this could demand from William, awaken in Charles, and eventually place upon George, Charlotte, and Louis. This was no reward. It was a duty capable of dividing every person she loved deeply. William watched his wife's face tighten and felt pride collide with dread. The prince knew Anne had placed Catherine beside him, not behind him. Yet the future king also knew his father could hear the decree as a verdict on his reign. He moved closer to her, but the gesture could not soften the silence around Charles. Anne set down her pen. She explained, through the recorded minutes of the meeting, that the decree had been prepared weeks earlier after she concluded that birthright alone could no longer protect the institution. Service required judgment. Continuity required courage. The crown needed someone who would defend its future without exploiting its weakness. Charles opened the copy delivered without warning. The king read, "True successor" twice, closed the folder, and said nothing. His silence offered no comfort. It could have meant agreement, humiliation, or fury held behind discipline. When the chamber doors closed, Catherine asked William why Anne had chosen this moment. He answered carefully. The reason, he believed, began with a private promise made long before either of them understood its power. The decree had named Catherine as the woman who could preserve the crown, but before she could accept that burden, she had to understand what Anne had seen in her and what Charles believed had just been taken from him. Behind the formal language of Anne's decree stood 4 people carrying 4 completely different fears. Catherine feared becoming a symbol more powerful than the woman beneath it. William feared being forced to choose between his wife and his father. Charles feared that history was already moving beyond him. And Anne, the architect of the decision, feared something darker, that without a decisive intervention, the monarchy might survive in name while losing the values that once made service meaningful. Catherine carried that fear into a private conversation with William, where she finally admitted what the decree had done to her. As the wife of the future king, and the mother of George, Charlotte, and Louis, she already understood the burden of being watched, measured, and judged. Her calm presence had become one of the monarchy's strongest sources of stability. Yet she had never demanded greater authority. That was why the phrase, "true successor," disturbed her. It felt less like praise, and more like a judgment against everyone else. William took her hand, but did not answer immediately. The prince understood that reassurance alone would not solve the deeper wound. His wife had been elevated by Anne, but that decision could place her directly against Charles in the eyes of the family. He felt proud of Catherine's strength, yet he also feared that his father would see her rise as proof that his own influence was fading. Charles felt exactly that. The king sat alone with the decree before him, turning his signet ring slowly while staring at Anne's signature. A signet ring is a royal seal worn as a symbol of personal authority, and in that moment, It seemed to remind him of everything he believed was slipping away. His pain was not simply that Catherine had been raised. It was that his own sister had named someone else as the clearest guardian of royal continuity. Anne remained controlled, but her certainty had been built over decades. She had watched popularity change, scandals erupt, and loyalty weaken. To her, applause was temporary. Endurance was what protected the crown. Later, she explained her choice to a trusted courtier in a documented private account. Catherine, she said, had repeatedly defended the institution without using family weakness to gain power. That restraint mattered more than ambition. William then discovered a confidential appendix attached to the decree. An appendix is an added section containing further instructions. It gave Catherine responsibilities over royal archives, family traditions, ceremonial guidance, and the preparation of the younger generation. One line stopped him cold. The failure witnessed at St. George's Hall. Catherine did not recognize it. Charles did. The decree had exposed the wounds beneath the family's formal smiles. Yet the true reason for Anne's decision remained hidden inside one moment at St. George's Hall. The incident that turned concern into irreversible action. Every royal rupture has a moment that seems insignificant until history returns to it. For Anne, that moment occurred inside St. George's Hall during a private ceremony intended to demonstrate unity. No cameras captured what happened. No public statement acknowledged it. Yet one exchange, witnessed by only a handful of people, convinced her that the monarchy was drifting toward a dangerous divide, and that Catherine, not the loudest voice in the room, had become the only person capable of pulling it back. Weeks before the decree, senior members of the family gathered to discuss how royal duty would be presented to the next generation. St. George's Hall, a ceremonial chamber used for major royal gatherings, was meant to provide a calm setting for decisions about George's preparation and the future division of public responsibilities. Charles arrived determined to protect the arrangements already in place. The king believed continuity required firmness. William disagreed. He urged a slower transition and argued that Catherine should have greater authority in guiding the younger royals. Catherine listened until the discussion turned directly to George. She proposed delaying several ceremonial duties, explaining that her son needed time to understand what the crown would eventually demand from him. Charles dismissed the concern sharply. Personal discomfort, he insisted, could never be allowed to interfere with royal necessity. The monarch believed early exposure would strengthen the boy. Catherine believed it could quietly break him. Her reply changed everything. Catherine told Charles that duty without emotional preparation could damage both the child and the institution he was expected to serve. When the king refused to reconsider, she removed George's briefing folder from the table. A briefing folder is a collection of instructions prepared for official responsibilities, but to her it represented a burden being imposed too soon. She said she would not allow her son to become a symbol before he was old enough to understand the cost. William remained beside her, stunned by the firmness of her stand. The prince had supported caution, but Catherine had gone further. She had challenged the king without anger, threats, or any attempt to use her husband as protection. Anne watched closely. The princess saw Catherine stand alone against the room, asking for no applause and seeking no advantage. In that moment, she understood that the monarchy's greatest strength might no longer rest with the person holding the highest title, but with the person willing to protect its most vulnerable heir. Later that evening, Anne confronted Charles privately. She warned him that tradition became destructive when it demanded loyalty, but refused protection. The king answered that the crown could not be governed by parental fear. Anne left without another argument. At her residence, she opened a locked dispatch box, a secure case used to hold private royal papers, and removed an unfinished declaration she had promised never to use unless the family reached a moral crisis. St. George's Hall had shown Anne exactly who would protect the crown from its own instincts, but turning that realization into a decree meant confronting Charles face to face and forcing him to hear what his sister truly believed about his leadership. There were no advisors between them, no ceremonial phrases to soften the blow, and no audience to reward restraint. Anne entered Charles's private study, carrying the completed decree beneath her arm. He already knew why she had come. What followed was not merely an argument between a king and a princess. It was a collision between a brother desperate to defend his reign and a sister convinced that loyalty required her to say what everyone else had become too frightened to speak aloud. Anne had requested the meeting before issuing the decree, giving Charles one final chance to address her concerns about the monarchy's direction and Catherine's limited authority. The decree was a formal written order defining future royal responsibilities, and Charles expected its language to remain open to negotiation. Instead, Anne placed it before him and said the decision had already been made under the powers entrusted to her as guardian of family traditions and internal duties. Charles stared at the document, then looked directly at his sister. He asked whether she intended to replace him while he was still alive. The question carried more pain than anger. Anne answered without hesitation. Catherine was not replacing the king, she said. She was protecting what might remain after his choices had passed into history. The words struck hard. Charles rose so suddenly that his chair scraped backward. He accused Anne of humiliating him through his own daughter-in-law, turning Catherine into a judgment on everything he had built. The king believed his sister had crossed the line between warning and betrayal. Anne kept her voice steady, but the pain in her eyes exposed the cost of confronting the brother she had defended through years of scandal, pressure, and doubt. Anne then disclosed how close she had come to delaying the decree. Several senior figures had urged caution in recorded private consultations, warning that the decision could split the family and deepen public suspicion. She continued, because delay, in her view, had become another name for fear. Too many difficult truths had already been postponed until they became crises. Charles challenged Catherine's motives next. Anne stopped him immediately. She revealed that Catherine had been approached indirectly through a confidential conversation with a trusted courtier and had refused the proposal at first. The Princess of Wales had insisted she would accept no title or authority created to weaken Charles or compete with William. Her refusal had not ended Anne's plan. It had convinced her Catherine was worthy of it. Charles fell silent, but one suspicion remained. He asked whether William had helped prepare the decree. Anne met his gaze and answered, he did not know it existed. That answer changed the argument. Catherine's elevation had not been arranged through ambition, influence, or marital loyalty. It had been earned without calculation. Charles could dismiss the decree as an act of rebellion, but he could not accuse Catherine of engineering it, and the deeper he examined Anne's authority, the more he discovered that her decision was backed by powers he could not simply command away. Anne's signature carried emotional force, but emotion alone could not reshape the palace. Beneath the decree lay something far more formidable: years of delegated authority, sealed instructions, and responsibilities quietly entrusted to her because she had never sought the spotlight they could provide. Charles initially believed he could reduce the declaration to a symbolic gesture. Then the palace secretary opened the supporting file, and the king discovered that his sister's words were connected to obligations the institution had already agreed to honor. The secretary began with Anne's long-standing control over selected ceremonial trusts, family archives, training traditions, and internal codes shaping how future heirs entered public life. A ceremonial trust is an arrangement that protects specific royal customs and duties across generations. These powers had appeared limited when granted separately. Together, they formed a structure strong enough to support the decree. Charles read each clause while Anne remained silent. The king's anger slowly gave way to wounded disbelief as he recognized approvals from earlier years, including decisions he had once accepted without concern. He had never imagined those arrangements could be joined together and used to place Catherine at the center of royal continuity. What he had treated as routine administration had become the foundation of his sister's intervention. The palace secretary then explained the boundary of Catherine's new position. Her designation gave her no parliamentary sovereignty, the constitutional power exercised through the monarch, government, and parliament. It did, however, grant her decisive influence over the crown's moral, domestic, and generational direction. She would help determine not who inherited the throne, but how those approaching it were prepared to carry its burden. William entered after being summoned, and immediately understood the danger. The prince asked whether Catherine had been consulted, fearing his wife had been trapped inside another responsibility she felt unable to reject. Anne answered that Catherine knew nothing of the final language. Her earlier refusal had been recorded, but the princess's resistance had strengthened the case rather than weakened it. Anne then disclosed the decree's deepest source, a sealed framework created during the final years of the previous reign had authorized a trusted guardian to intervene if the monarchy's public future became separated from its internal values. The framework was not a new law. It was a binding family arrangement, preserved through signed instructions and accepted responsibilities. The confidential appendix went further. It gave Catherine oversight of the emotional and ceremonial preparation of George, Charlotte, and Louis. No child could be pushed into royal exposure without parental consent, structured guidance, and clear emotional support. Charles still had one option. Legal advisors confirmed that he could challenge the decree, but the process would expose the St. George's Hall confrontation and reveal why Catherine had removed George's briefing folder. The king now understood that overturning Anne's decision would cost more than authority. It could expose the very moment Catherine had protected George from the crown itself, and that knowledge turned private anger into immediate, dangerous fallout. By nightfall, the decree had passed through the palace like a silent alarm. Doors closed. Meetings were cancelled. Staff members were told to say nothing. Yet inside the family, silence offered no protection. Charles felt judged. William felt torn. And Catherine felt the walls of expectation closing around her. Anne had intended to secure the monarchy's future, but her decision had also forced every royal figure to reveal where loyalty ended and self-preservation began. Palace staff moved quickly to revise the internal briefing structure. A briefing structure is the system deciding who receives information, attends planning meetings, and influences future royal duties. Catherine would now be included in discussions about ceremonial training, upcoming appearances, and the public responsibilities of George, Charlotte, and Louis. That change mattered because it moved her from consultation into real influence, placing her judgment above officials who had shaped royal routines for years. Charles responded by postponing a family dinner scheduled for that evening. The king gave no public explanation, but the message was unmistakable. The decree had damaged more than administration. It had entered the family's most private space, turning a shared table into another place where resentment could no longer be hidden. Catherine received the revised briefing folder in her apartment. She opened it, saw her name listed above several long-serving officials, and closed it at once. The princess felt no victory. She feared the household would assume she had wanted this elevation, that Charles would see ambition where there had only been reluctance, and that William would be trapped between defending her and protecting his father. William found her alone, and immediately sensed the depth of her distress. She told him she would surrender the decree, rather than become the reason he lost Charles. The prince took her hand, but his answer was firm. His father's pain, he said, could not be healed by asking her to become smaller. Catherine had spent years carrying pressure without complaint. Erasing her authority now would not restore peace. It would reward fear. Charles, meanwhile, instructed his private secretary to examine every route for limiting Anne's decision. A private secretary is the senior aide who manages confidential royal work and advice. Yet the king refused to approve a formal challenge after learning that the supporting records included decisions he had previously accepted himself. Anne then received a handwritten message from her brother. "You have chosen her over your king." She folded the note carefully, but tears came before she placed it in a drawer. The princess had defended Charles for decades. Now loyalty had become the very reason he felt betrayed. Catherine finally understood that no advisor could repair the fracture. She asked William to arrange a private meeting with Charles, without Anne or palace officials. The decree had divided the family into loyalties and wounds, but Catherine refused to let others fight in her name. Before the crown could harden around her, she chose to face the king as a daughter-in-law rather than a successor. When Catherine entered Charles's private room, she carried no folder, no prepared statement, and no visible symbol of Anne's decree. For the first time since the announcement, the crisis was reduced to two people rather than titles. A father-in-law who believed his reign had been diminished. A daughter-in-law who had been elevated without asking. What passed between them would not erase the decree, but it would determine whether the decision became an act of family destruction or a painful beginning. Catherine had insisted that no aides, legal advisors, or William be present. She wanted Charles to hear her intentions directly, not through the language of the decree. The briefing folder, the official file explaining duties and authority, remained untouched as she took the chair opposite him. Charles stayed seated. The king's silence made the distance between them feel greater than any title. Catherine spoke first. She told him she had never asked to be called the crown's true successor and would reject the phrase if it had been created to erase his service. Her voice trembled, but she did not retreat from Anne's concern for George, Charlotte, and Louis. The princess believed royal duty could shape a child, yet without protection, it could also wound one. Charles listened until restraint gave way to honesty. He admitted that the decree felt like a judgment already written against him, as though his family had begun recording the history of his failures before his reign was over. Catherine did not deny his pain. She answered that history would also remember whether he allowed the next generation to learn from what had hurt him. That reply broke through something deeper. Charles revealed that he had understood her decision at St. George's Hall more than he had admitted. His anger came from recognition. Catherine had protected George in the way he once wished someone had protected him, before duty became a burden he was expected to carry without question. Catherine then offered a compromise. She would ask Anne to revise the language while preserving responsibilities attached to the decree. Charles refused. Changing the words now, he said, would make her appear ashamed of the qualities the monarchy urgently needed: restraint, courage, and compassion under pressure. Before Catherine left, Charles stood. He took the untouched folder and placed it into her hands. There was no formal blessing, no grand apology, only a warning spoken with sincerity. Carry it without becoming imprisoned by it. Charles had not defeated the decree, and Catherine had not surrendered it. Their private honesty transformed it from a weapon into a responsibility. But outside the palace, the words "true successor" were already about to ignite the world. The palace had spent hours containing the decree, but one phrase escaped every barrier: the crown's true successor. By sunrise, it appeared across broadcasts, phone screens, and newspaper stands. Some interpreted it as Anne's rejection of Charles. Others saw it as the clearest endorsement Catherine had ever received. Yet the public response changed when one image emerged, not of Catherine celebrating, but of her walking beside the king with the decree held low at her side. The palace released a controlled statement before speculation could harden into accepted truth. Anne's decree, it explained, concerned service, continuity, royal education, and the protection of family traditions. It did not alter the constitutional succession, the legal order determining who inherits the throne. Yet the clarification only deepened the debate, because it confirmed that Catherine had been granted something harder to define than rank: moral authority. Broadcasters immediately questioned whether the monarchy had entered a new era. Some argued that royal influence could no longer depend on inheritance alone. Character, public trust, and emotional resilience now seemed equally important. Others warned that Anne had created two competing centers of power, with Charles holding the crown, while Catherine carried the values the public increasingly associated with it. William watched the coverage beside his wife, and heard commentators describe her as more powerful than his father. The prince stiffened, but Catherine reacted first. She switched off the television and said she would not allow a private reconciliation to be turned into public warfare. Her elevation had already caused enough pain. She refused to let success be built upon Charles's humiliation. Anne faced a different storm. Praise arrived from those who believed she had acted with courage, while condemnation accused her of weakening her brother. The princess later admitted to William, in a recorded private conversation, that she had never wanted the king to feel replaced. She wanted Charles to recognize what Catherine could preserve before pride destroyed the chance. Then one newspaper captured the public mood. Its front page carried the headline, "Anne chooses Catherine," above a photograph of Catherine and Charles leaving a palace service together, his hand briefly resting against her arm. The image challenged the story of open rebellion. It suggested pain, restraint, and the beginning of acceptance. Outside Buckingham Palace, a waiting crowd applauded as Catherine's car entered the gates. She did not respond with triumph. She lowered her head, visibly emotional, making clear that she saw the decree as sacrifice rather than victory. That evening, Charles summoned Anne and Catherine for one final meeting. The king was ready to decide whether the declaration would remain a weapon dividing the family or become part of the monarchy's settled future. The public had already decided that Catherine represented the monarchy's next chapter, but only Charles could decide whether that chapter would begin with resentment or with the rarest royal act of all, acceptance. The final meeting contained none of the anger that had defined the hours before it. Charles stood beside the window. Anne remained near the table where the decree rested. Catherine waited between them, unwilling to claim victory over either one. 3 figures, 3 different understandings of duty, and one decision capable of changing their family forever. When Charles finally spoke, he did not challenge Anne's authority. He gave the decree what it had lacked from the beginning: acceptance. Charles confirmed that Anne's decree would stand in full. The decree, a formal written order defining duties, would preserve Catherine's authority over royal continuity, family traditions, ceremonial preparation, and protection of the younger generation. Compassion was no longer private. It had become part of how the monarchy prepared those expected to serve it. The palace also settled the meaning of true successor. The phrase described moral guardianship, not a change to the constitutional succession, the legal order deciding who inherits the throne. William's position remained secure, and Charles's reign was not rejected. Charles then faced Anne. The king admitted that her method had wounded him, but her warning had not been wrong. Anne answered that she would accept his anger before watching the family repeat its oldest mistakes. Catherine made her first request. She asked for a gentler preparation system for George, Charlotte, and Louis, one that taught service without taking away childhood. Charles approved it immediately. The monarch finally understood that protection was not weakness. Anne explained through the meeting's recorded account why Catherine had earned her trust. Power had been placed within reach, yet the princess's first instinct was reconciliation, not dominance. Her refusal to exploit the decree became the final proof. William entered after the decision was settled. Charles told his son that Catherine had not been placed above him, but beside him, carrying the human responsibility accompanying his future role. The prince understood that his marriage had been recognized as a partnership. Anne closed the folder. Charles walked beside Catherine, and William took his wife's hand. No one had been defeated. Each had accepted a different duty. Princess Anne's decree did not crown Catherine as a rival monarch. It crowned her as the monarchy's conscience, trusted to protect its values when tradition became rigid or duty forgot the people carrying it. For Charles, the moment demanded humility. For Anne, it proved loyalty required confrontation. For William, it confirmed that Catherine's authority strengthened his future. For her, the decree became a promise that the next generation would inherit a crown shaped by sacrifice and compassion. The decree remained, the family accepted its meaning, and Catherine stepped forward, not as the woman who took the crown from anyone, but as the woman chosen to ensure it remained worthy of being inherited. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.